group project, we have to prepare a presentation for the most important points in our multi-draft writing project. So for the first part of my project, we have to write 2 paragraphs defining our central arguments or concepts from the book made by the writer. So for my first concept, it's an important idea in my book is culture and the pride that paisanos take in being part of it. My second concept is, in addition, the author also focuses on immigration and the racism Mexican paisanos endure in the eyes of gabachos. That's the first part. The second part, I have to write 2 to 3 pages summarizing the book that I read. So my thesis says, Gustavo Arellano, author of Ask a Mexican, created his book of the nationally syndicated column to report candid dialogue about racism, to address assumptions made about Mexicans, and to give insight into Mexican culture. With that, I wrote 3 topic sentences that I can use for my paragraphs. So the first one is, Arellano engages in candid dialogue about racism while addressing the undermining questions made about the readers of the column. The second one is, Gustavo Arellano continues to address assumptions made about Mexican culture, language, and the work ethic. And the last one is, ultimately, Arellano provides an insight to Mexican culture aside from the tacos and enchiladas. Going to part 3, we have to decide whether or not the author presents a fair or biased argument to his or her audience. So, in my opinion, I put that his argument is unfair because he is negatively criticizing the opposer and because he has a Mexican-American background. So, towards that, he's more defensive to Mexicans and he's really rude to those opposing it. The fourth part is, to what extent do you agree with the central arguments made by the writer? So we had to write survey questions and we had to do 6, but I'm gonna say 3. The first one I did was, the author asserts that Mexicans are dehumanized by Americans. Do you agree or disagree? My second one is, how would you respond to criticism while being offended by opposers? A, hit them with facts. B, criticize the opposers back. Or C, walk away. So with this one, I can see what other people how they would react while being criticized. I know the author of the book, he decided to criticize the opposers back. So, and the fourth one is, according to our current immigration laws, do you believe they're fair or unfair, and why? And yep, that's it.
My essay is about the inequalities of America. The way that I came up with that is obviously from my book, and my book is from Tales of Two Americas. And on the title, basically it describes what it is. It's about stories of inequality in a divided nation. It goes from racism to sexism, or sexist. Talks about drugs, and all like the inequalities in it. For example, with racism, main point that they talk about is just how people are obviously being treated because of their skin color. An example they give in this is in a story, on their actually opening story. It's about a African American male who is sitting down at a bench park and doing absolutely nothing besides eating his sandwich on his lunch, and white pedestrians walked by just with their dog and they felt feared, so they called the police. And when the police got there, they seen him reach into his pocket, which he was just pulling out, I think, a lighter to smoke a cigarette, and they shot him, and they didn't even talk to him. But then they have other stories in here that show like, but when the police authorities, when they have interactions with Caucasians, they do approach them differently, and that's usually why African Americans are killed at a higher rate compared to Caucasians. They also talk about drugs, or not so much this one's a drug, but it's tobacco, more cigarettes. How like they place them in certain areas, they sell more cigarettes, and lower income areas, like just where the like yeah lower income areas, and they just do that to target, um, you know, those um, those groups of people compared to higher like income people, and so usually, and so that's where they usually build it, and so that's one thing that they use. It's like a marketing tool. Same thing goes with food accessibility. Like to in order to get the right nutrients and all that, um, and like you need to eat the proper food, and they talk about how in certain areas they make it harder for lower income people to access that. That's because of the price range it is, and so because of that, because they can't afford it, they're not able to get the proper nutrition, which leads to further problems in life like health care, and so that leads to bad health, and also on health care, how when you don't have the funds for it, you cannot access it, and so those are just a few examples of how they talk about the inequalities, which is like the racism between the African American and the Caucasians, how they get treated, the way that they market their stores with like tobacco, and as well as like the way that they locate like grocery stores as well. Like Costco's and like Sam's Clubs, and those they're not gonna be in like the bad parts. They're gonna be more in like better areas, and so that's one thing to talk about. Another thing um, is immigration policies. They'll also talk about, but mainly the whole book is just about the inequalities in America and how like certain ethnicities are treated differently. And for me, the book is just really interesting because a lot of it is true. And that's really all I had to say about it.
In this group project, we have been asked to write a multi-draft essay divided into 4 parts. The first part would be defining 2 central arguments the writer makes in the book. In the new Jim Crow law, the book I did my essay on, one of the arguments the author tries to point out is that racial discrimination in our current societies due to previous Jim Crow laws in the time of slavery. An additional argument the author tries to make is that ethnic mass incarceration is also a result of the new Jim Crow laws. The second part is just practically asking us to summarize the entire book. The Jim Crow laws is just practically explaining slavery throughout history, before the new Jim Crow laws and after the new Jim Crow laws, which is right now in our current society. And part 3 is just asking us to present whether or not the author makes a fair or biased argument. I would say the author, for the most part, makes a pretty fair argument because not only does she include counter arguments, she doesn't just look at the situation from her point of view and her experiences, but she tries to get a little bit of everyone's input to see so that the public could have a better understanding. Part 4 is just asking us if we agree or disagree with the author's argument. I would say I agree because there's still discrimination occurring throughout our society. Even though the Jim Crow laws no longer apply, I believe that due to all these barriers we haven't broken down, we still view things in a stereotypical way. So we tend to generalize and discriminate even though we are in a new age, and that sums it up for the most part.